Hi, everyone. Welcome to our 14th episode. I can't believe it, 14 of Game Changer Sessions, our weekly live stream where we bring brilliant minds and warm hearts to the Toronto and sort of global innovation community to help us navigate these very interesting times. We're really interested in how we thrive at this level of uncertainty, how we create in this uncertainty, and what the future is going to look like. We've had guests that have been fantastic, such as Roger Marden, number one management thinker, Margaret Atwood, Albert Wenger, Boris Wertz, Adam Grant, and many more join us. And today I couldn't think of a better guest to help us understand what is going on in the world surrounding scale and surrounding what we need to be thinking about as it relates to COVID and cities and the future of cities as the guest we have today. I'm very, very excited to welcome Geoffrey West. Geoffrey is a visionary theoretical physicist, former president and distinguished professor of the Santa Fe Institute. He was listed as one of the top 100 most influential people in the world, and I definitely understand why. He is the author of the incredibly powerful book called Scale, which Vinod Khosla, a previous investor of mine, actually said is a number one must read. And when I actually started thinking about COVID and the idea that the world is being taught a lesson in scale, I was secretly smiling, thinking Geoffrey must be having a good laugh at how people are now learning about his brilliant work. So, Geoffrey, welcome to Game Changer Sessions. It's really wonderful to have you here.
Thank you, Candice. Thank you so much for inviting me. Delighted to be on your show, so to speak. And thank you also for your embarrassingly flattering introduction. I'm not sure I can live up to the billing, but I'm sure we'll have a very stimulating and interesting conversation.
Well, it is definitely easy to do for someone like you. And Geoffrey, as you know, I've been a huge fan of your work for many years, and so much so that I kept bugging you to come and share your insights with the Toronto business community not so long ago. And that was done in person, something that we are not able to do very easily right now. And so to get started, for our broader audience, I thought, let's just sort of lay the foundation. You have done phenomenal research and work in understanding the laws of scale. To get started, maybe we can just talk at the highest level around some of the questions that your work is able to answer. For the audience here, Geoffrey's work looks at the math behind why we can live to 120 and no longer, or very easily no longer. Why, mice can only live to 2 to 3 years and elephants 75. And why, certain cities, get to a maximum size. Can you kind of give a sense of what some of these laws are around scale that can set the foundation for this chat?
Sure. I'll try to keep it very brief, but they really, the question one asks is deceptively simple. That is, what happens if you have some system and you scale it up? If you double the size, you get twice as much of everything that's in it. And the answer, of course, is, generically speaking, absolutely not. And the work that originally got me excited was, in fact, in biology. And that was to do with metabolic rate. That is how much, so to speak, food you need each day to stay alive. The sort of 2,000 food calories. And how does that change with the size of animals? And the remarkable thing is, naively, you might have expected double the size, double the amount of food. But in fact, systematically, you only need 75%. That is, if you go from 2 grams to 4 grams, or 200 kilograms to 400 kilograms, it doesn't matter. It always goes up by this 75%. And so you get a 25% savings with each doubling roughly. That's called a scaling law. And the thing that's amazing in biology is that almost anything that you can measure physiologically or about our life history, that is how long we live, which you talked about a moment ago, how long it takes to mature, how many offspring you have, but also all your physiology, anything that you can measure, they all satisfy these extraordinarily simple scaling laws. And the work that got me excited was to try to understand those. And to cut a very long story short, it all resides in the one thing that's common across all animals, because these scaling laws apply to all animals and plants across all biology at all scales. The thing that unifies all of them is the fact that we're all network systems. And whether it's something like our circulatory system or even our brains. And it is the mathematics and physics of those, the generic properties of those networks that lead rise to these scaling laws. And the idea was to take those into understanding cities and to discover, in fact, that cities satisfy similar scaling laws, but with a different quantitative. It's not, you don't sort of
Right.
save 25%, you save 15% every time you double the size of a city. So that was the idea.
Amazing.
And,
And
I just want
I'm
to add
gonna,
one last thing.
yeah, yeah.
And that is that's crucial in this was a new discovery was that it's to do with the socioeconomic activity of the city, was the fundamental part of a city, and that is that every time you double, instead of saving 15% on all the socioeconomic quantities, you gain 15%. So the bigger you are, double the size, you gain roughly 15% more wealth, more social activity, more education, but you also gain 15% more crime, 50% more disease, and 15% more COVID-19.
That is a very, very, very good segue and a great explanation. And so I do want to just set the foundation for this chat. I'm just getting a few comments that it's a little bit noisy, so I'd love to just make sure that people now it's not noisy for people. One of the things I want everybody to know is my background may look a little bit different today, and that's because I'm not in a city, and we're going to talk about the future of cities with Geoffrey based on a lot of these dynamics that we're talking about. I'm actually far away, 3.5 hours north of Toronto, and in a small town where I'm literally using a real estate office to host this live stream. So hopefully the sound has now minimized, but I apologize if there's some issues with our sound. So that's a good setting. So Geoffrey, that was very, very helpful and a lot of information. And I think what's so interesting about what you're talking about is that there are these laws. Hang on one second. I just want to make sure. Yes. Okay. We're good on the sound stuff now. There are laws that basically say certain things scale sublinearly, others scale super linearly, right? And this is in nature, and these things happen in biology, right? Which is sort of your mice and elephants example. And these things happen in cities too. And what you're seeing now is we're seeing some of this happen with COVID, which is a super linear scaling phenomenon. Am I interpreting what you're saying
that's
correctly?
correct. So
Okay.
biology is dominated by something that called sublinear, which is that the bigger you are, the less per capita, less per cell in biology, by about 25%. So there's this great economy of scale in biology. Now, cities also have an economy of scale, which is in its physical infrastructure. But the really interesting part of a city is its socioeconomic activity. That's why we have cities. There's no point in all those buildings and roads without facilitating social interactions. It's the machine for encouraging, facilitating social interactions to create wealth, to create ideas, and so on, to create increased standards of living. And that is superlinear, meaning the bigger you are, the more per capita of all these socioeconomic activities. And that arises because of the positive feedback mechanisms inherent in social networks. So fundamental to city is this phenomenon, this extraordinary thing that human beings discovered of forming networks, discovering language, exchange information, and create, as I say, wealth and ideas and all the fantastic things that we have. But it comes with a heavy price, which is something that we tend to sweep under the rug, because along with ideas, patents, and innovation, and wealth, and education, and knowledge comes crime, disease, inequality, environmental damage, and so on. And they all come along amazingly to the same degree. That is the same kind of scaling law, this 15% sort of value added with the doubling comes with for all those activities. And because they're all interrelated to the dynamics of social interaction.
Super powerful. And so I think that was really helpful, Geoffrey, because you just kind of reframed and restated for some people where there was a bit of noise, this idea of that things scale, increasingly more in cities, right? And it's both the good, the intended consequences of having things networked, right? And that's why cities have been so powerful. But there's also unintended consequences of being connected. And, this gets me to, chaos theory and understanding the fact, that things are networked and that we're living in a very complex adaptive system.
Right.
And so, one thing I'd love for you to maybe connect the dots on is, why do people need to understand chaos theory and complex adaptive systems as it relates to scale? What's the interconnectedness here about?
Well, I think we have to recognize that the world around us is both complex, meaning it's got huge numbers of agents and components and actors all interacting with each other, and that it's continually adapting and evolving because of all those interactions. And it is no accident that if you double the size of a city, you get twice as many, you expect to get twice as many patents, twice the amount of innovation, but you're also going to expect to get not twice, 15% more. You're going to get 15% more crime and 15% more COVID, because underlying it is that same social connectivity. And the fantastic thing, of course, that we've begun to recognize is that all of these things are interconnected. And as a complement to the traditional way of doing science, which is reducing, deconstructing, we need to think more integratively and more systemically. And therefore, we should not have been surprised, actually, that some arbitrary random mutation of a virus in a far-off city in China causes me to have trouble finding yeast to make bread, for Hertz to go bankrupt in the United States, for social unrest around the world. And what did I heard something today? Well, for sport, for no football in Spain. I mean, but all sort of interconnected. They're all interconnected. It's a fantastic phenomenon. We should not have been surprised. And not only that, we should not have been surprised that it happened at an exponential rate. And that's also a crucial aspect where these things happen exponentially, which means typically they're hard to predict and they're very hard to control unless you intervene at the beginning.
Right. And I think this work, this is not new, is what you're saying, right? These are principles that have existed forever. It's just that the world is being taught this lesson in a very visceral way, where it's impacting everyone. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I would just correct you slightly. I think the ideas behind complexity and chaos have been around for, one could argue maybe as long as 50 years, and some incipient ideas related to it were developed much earlier, but it wasn't recognized as having a serious impact till really towards the end of the last century, 20, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And it's only now that we're beginning to recognize how critical it is to understand things in this somewhat complementary way. And the scaling phenomenon I've talked about is sort of a link between the more traditional way of doing science. There's a little bit of deconstruction in that, obviously, and there's also, it's highly quantitative, it needs to be quantitative, and it needs to have ultimately a theoretical basis based on principles and be able to be predictive ultimately. So, and that is it's taken us a long time, I would say, to appreciate how critical it is. In order to understand the messy world around us, we need to think in terms of complex adaptive systems, and chaotic phenomena are just one piece of that.
Mm-hmm. And
You know,
so if you're
it's by the. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if you're thinking in that way, what is your advice, for people to build the right mental model and the right framework for something like COVID? If you're using complex adaptive systems as the model, chaos theory, and these laws of scaling, what have people gotten wrong? I guess is the question I would ask.
Well, I would say that what's wrong is less to do with the science, to be honest. I mean, the science is still
Mhm.
being developed. Certainly, epidemiology of itself, in a certain sense, understood some of this, and epidemiology goes back over 100 years. The foundations of it, the mathematical foundations, dealing with malaria. But the real problem is something that is quite chronic in society, and that is the gap between scientific knowledge and scientific thinking and policymakers and politicians and leadership. And it's most chronic, sadly, in the United States at the moment. And that's most unfortunate in terms of the timing. But so I put it, I mean, it's not that the science is well developed in terms of thinking systemically. We are thinking more and more, and lots of ideas are developed and lots of ways of dealing with the problem. But what I've tried to do in terms of my own kind of evangelical outreach is to try to at least expose people that are in a position to make decisions about institutions, whether they're a company or whether they're a city or whatever, a university, is to at least incorporate that kind of thinking to complement the traditional way where you break everything down into, you slice it up into
Silence.
departments, which by the way has been enormously successful, and should we should continue to do. But we need to now see that that's part of some whole, and it's a bit of a platitude, but the whole is much greater than the sum of its parts. And we need to understand that and take it seriously and put it into a science, make it into a serious quantitative science.
And are there people you think are doing this well as it relates to COVID and understanding the impact and scenarios of COVID?
Oh,
And can you highlight, or I mean, it's so different and it's such a radical departure in many ways from how businesses, cities, policymakers have operated previously. So to your point,
yeah.
this is relatively new to think in this integrated way and in a way that is much more complex, interrelated, and networked. So, who is thinking this way, and how can we
Well,
sort of take that into our business decision making and sort of government decision making?
yeah,
Who can
sadly,
you
very
point
few
to?
people. No, I can't point to very many people at all. I mean, it sounds very parochial. I'd only point to the Santa Fe Institute where I work because it was founded to do exactly that and has had a huge
Right.
impact, actually. But, and there are quite a few people associated with it, including some of the major players, by the way, in providing models of COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
But thinking in the bigger picture, there are people, but it's few and far between. And it's very hard to get it across. I mean, I'll give you an example, and I'll probably get clobbered for this. But, Bill Gates reacted. Bill Gates has been talking, and I have a tremendous respect for it, that for about the threat of pandemics. Many of us have seen this. And in fact, I just want to say one that I'm going to be somewhat immodest, but in talks that I've given in the past, and I think even when I talked, everybody would have forgotten in Toronto a year or two
No, yeah.
ago, I showed pictures I was talking about cities, what goes on in cities and the threats in cities, and I showed picture of everybody wearing masks as we do now. I found a picture of when there was an epidemic in a city and people were wearing masks. I said, that is what's going to happen. And then the next picture was one of social unrest, people, rioting and so on. And one has to understand that these are all interconnected, all these things again. And an example, like, as I say, I may get covered for, is Bill Gates, who's been fantastic in predicting, if you like, or at least being concerned about a pandemic, immediately turned all of his energy, all of his fund, all of his Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation towards finding a vaccine. That's it. Yeah, that's it. Because he's been very big on this kind of thing, which is great. But, that's a short-term issue. We do need the vaccine and we do need to address it, but we also need to put serious funding and provide serious support for people realizing that if you want to stop Hertz going bankrupt and you want to have your city survive and you don't want to have shortage of yeast, which is I'm very passionate about, by the way, is because I just made bread this morning, by the way.
Excellent.
Then you got to think beyond that. So yes, put 90% of your effort into the vaccine, but put 10% and get people to think big, in an integrated way, a systemic way about this, and see that getting a vaccine is just one actually extremely important, but one tiny piece of the whole dynamic. And the whole dynamic had to do with some bloody virus mutating arbitrarily, and it's going to mutate again. And we're going to have more of these, and we need to be positioned, and we should have been positioned to address this in a bigger way.
Right.
But ultimately, as I said earlier, the problem is having leadership also that responds to it, respects it, and the fact that, for example, I don't know what is true in the Canadian Parliament, but in the US Congress, at best, there is one serious scientist, Bill Foster from Illinois. Otherwise, there isn't. I mean, there's lots of people that parade as scientists, but they're doctors who are not scientists typically.
Right. No, I think what you're saying is very true. And in fact, we had the Creative Destruction Lab, which I know you're familiar with, because that's how we met, the Mark for Machine Learning, where, they are actually, and I'm a part of the lab, we're taking a look at startups, innovation science that can actually help us use information to predict, who has and who does not have COVID in a way that allows us to limit these very blunt tools, right? Of, forcing everybody to be at home in the event that in the worst scenario, this doesn't, improve for the next few years. And I think what you're saying is even bigger, which is this is just one of many things that are likely to happen that we aren't able to predict, and that the impact of that is going to be far more wide ranging and less obvious than the immediate thing, like finding the vaccine for that specific thing. And so, what I'm interested in is, because you understand this and you've spent so much time looking at cities and the benefits, the intended impact and the unintended consequences of having density and social networks physically be together, what are your thoughts on the future of cities? Do you think people are going to continue to live in cities and have them be, the clusters of innovation and wealth and prosperity? Or is this an inflection point in society? Because you've talked a lot about this is unsustainable in cities as well. What is your, thoughts today?
Well, of course, once we move into this territory, it's speculation, needless to say. On the other hand, I will try to relate it to, stuff that has been verified scientifically at least, but it is speculation. So in terms of the future of cities, I would bet a lot on the fact that they will be just fine. This is a big event. Obviously, it's a discontinuity in our lives. it's a discontinuity in our socioeconomic lives, and discontinuities, shifts like this, one of their characteristics is that they accelerate things that were already happening. They, of course, produce new things too, needless to say, but they, in particular, accelerate things that are already in the works, so to speak. One of which is what we're doing. I mean, we could have done this before, but there's a bigger, we're all doing this kind of thing, and that's one of the big questions about the future of cities. Because if it were true that you could live your life the way we've been living, I've been living it anyway. I've been stuck in this house, which I've enjoyed very much for the last several months. I hardly ever go out except for walks. I see almost no one, but I'm interacting in this soulless kind of two-dimensional way with lots of people. And the question is, could that continue? And the answer is almost certainly no. I think, one of the things that has brought us to where we are has been the very essence of social networking. That is, people in proximity with each other, interacting. And I think that indeed, we need both social closeness and we need physical closeness. And I think that's sort of in our DNA a little bit. And so the great paradox, the great dilemma at the moment is that the very dynamic which brought us our success, which is, as you say, bringing together people, which is what the engine of the city is doing, facilitating interaction, that is the very thing that increases the spread of disease. That's why they come together in the scaling laws, for example. And indeed, the mathematics, it's sort of interesting, because the mathematics of the spread of disease is essentially the same as the mathematics of the spread of ideas and innovation. It's the same mathematics, because it's the mathematics of interacting between each other.
Super
And
large scale, yeah.
the only difference is in disease, COVID-19, you want to have the number of people recovered going to 100%. Whereas the spread of ideas, you want the number of people recovering to go to zero. You want everybody to believe. If you're, in whatever your idea you're trying to spread, or
Sure.
the product
Yeah.
you're trying to do. And that's the only, but the mathematics is the same. It's just that what you demand as the end result is quite different. The city has this dilemma that, and we have this dilemma that you have control over shutting down information, social information exchange by social distancing. But actually, it's physical distancing. You don't actually give a shit about social distancing. In fact,
Sure.
you want to maintain social distancing, which is what this is doing, and it's saving
Right.
us. But you want to, of course, decrease the amount of physical interaction. And so that's a big problem for cities. So the future of cities depends to a large extent on how successful you are in getting vaccines, going back to our previous. So I
Right.
applaud what Bill Gates and others are trying to do.
Yep.
That's obvious and it's fantastic. We will get something, but the question is, how good will it be? If it's as good as the flu, we're fine. That is, we can live with the flu. That is, we just accept that a certain relatively small number of people are going to die every year, and many people will get sick, but we live with it. And hopefully this thing will eventually evolve to be like that and controlled by that. But I think that cities are unbelievably resilient, and they will continue. We've dropped atom bombs on cities. 25 years later, they're fine. COVID-19 is a bit of an atom bomb, frankly, and I wish Mr. Trump could have seen it that way. It's
So
and I think we are resilient enough to overcome COVID-19 as cities,
sure.
because it's in our DNA. We need that.
Well, I love, I really hope that is true because I love
I do
cities,
too.
and I saw your wonderful piece in The Economist that I will tell everybody to read on, the future of New York and this place that has
Oh, yeah.
been certainly of this century, idolized in terms of, what it has brought from a cultural perspective, from an
Sure.
economic prosperity perspective. But I will say, because I am in technology and I spend a lot of my time
Yeah.
thinking about the future, I see this splitting of the idea of social networks and physical networks becoming more
Sure.
and more mainstream. And
Oh, yeah.
so, how strongly do you resist the notion that this is sort of an inflection point where our social networks become virtual and we find new innovative ways to meet people, to spend time in virtual reality, to find spontaneous collisions through technology, to build remote work establishments and global workforces? I mean, what I'm noticing from, some of the best companies that are technology companies is this decision, which is most probably
Hmm.
related to risk and liability as much as the future of work, to say we are okay to be a global remote work environment. Do you think this offers a big threat to the future of cities if that becomes the norm?
I don't see it as a threat. I think threat's the wrong word. It will certainly change. As I said, there will obviously be changes. And certainly, one of the things, again, that was already happening was associated with interacting like this was, of course, working at home. That was already beginning to happen. And this has been hugely accelerated and will have a big impact, obviously, because it's going to mean lots of people will stay home. Whether they leave cities or not depends a lot on lots of other factors. And you know, we're talking about the few percent when you talk about people being able to leave the city to do what some of us are able to do. Um,
Sure.
Most people are not able to. They need to be in the city. So there's that whole thing just for their livelihood. And secondly, I also think there is a fundamental need for group interaction at some level. I mean, the pressure to have football games and baseball games and have crowds there is enormous. The pressure for people all to go downtown or go to bars is enormous, and it's sort of there, and it's counterproductive, of course, in the present circumstance. But it is the sort of raw dynamic that is at work. And so I think that cities will change. And one of the things it might do is, of course, it may reverse the sort of negative image of suburbia that people may see that. I mean, one of the things that people may not realize is that suburbia sort of grew out of, in a certain sense, an analog to what's happened now. There was, the invention of the garden city at the turn of the, 1900 roughly, um, was in fact to provide an environment away from the pollution and dirt of cities for the workers. I mean, not for the professional class necessarily, but primarily for the workers, so that you would be in a sort of quote garden city. And out of that sort of evolved the idea of suburbia tacked onto a city. And that of course then got a bad rap ultimately because suburbia is so boring. And because that's the point. I mean, it doesn't have the excitement, buzz, and sexiness of a city. And so, of an inner city, I should say. And so I think but on the other hand, it may be that at least in the near future, we will see more and more people moving towards suburban living or moving towards smaller communities. That is
Mm-hmm.
certainly true. But I still think that overall, it ain't going to change very much. And one of the reasons for that is that the other thing that's very hard to put into the equation, so to speak, is people have very short memories. It could easily be in a year or two, you'll be hearing, well, it wasn't so bad, actually, especially because it only really affected, in terms of the majority of people, old farts like me. I mean, people over 60 were the ones that were most vulnerable. Young, healthy people like you, you might get the disease, but you're not threatened
Mm-hmm.
with your life, whereas I am, and so
Right.
and so that will become more and more apparent, and so I think there'll be I could imagine that there'd be a bump, a little bump, and then the city will sort of relax back to roughly what it is. But these other changes will take place to do with working at home, the sense of
Right.
an office will change, all kinds of things like that will very quickly evolve. Transportation will change,
Mhm.
gathering
Well,
will change. So,
that's what I want to really push on a little bit is unlike certain other um, catastrophes or things that have happened, this requires the networks to be modified, the
yeah,
transportation network, the health networks,
right.
the way a society is able to live, and not contract this disease is really important in terms of getting people
Hmm.
back into cities. And so, you talked a little bit about the lack of leadership in the US as it relates to the infrastructure in many ways of creating safe cities. How do you think that will manifest? Because I mean, just looking this past week, we are seeing now again a rising number of cases. To your point on,
Yeah.
chaos theory and the butterfly effect, had this been dealt with in the early stages of this system, we wouldn't be having these conversations. How is that what do you think cities can and should be doing around infrastructure to actually allow people to return to cities or to have a fighting chance that the cities will recover?
Yeah, that's a very tough question, of course. But um, I mean, cities are already trying to do this, of course. I mean, where you limit, the gathering of people. Obviously, you limit major gatherings and so forth, and that, how permanent that will become, we don't know. Do we have? I mean, can you imagine that you have a baseball or football stadium and every other seat is empty? Just as we were talking about on airplanes,
Mhm.
and we've not enforced that for transportation. Um, some airlines, for example, are keeping middle seats open, whereas others are allowing it when they have enough passengers. So, and probably, there's this huge economic cost to do that, because the smart thing would be to do, until we get this thing under control, obviously, um, is to keep physical distancing. And if you want to, maybe you could open a stadium or an event, but you'd have to keep people apart. So instead of having, 75,000 people, you'd only have 25,000 people, and so on. It's the same thing, the same kind of logic that stores open, but only a 25% capacity of the people that could be in there, so they can be distanced. But it
Mhm.
causes huge, upheaval, and it's not clear within a short period of time that one can adapt. That many businesses and institutions can adapt. I mean, universities. Oh, I'm sorry. Let me turn that. Oh, I can't do it. Sorry. I'm on my own here, so
All
I
good.
don't have full control. So we'll just listen to the ring in the background. It's probably,
That's
I'm
fine.
sure it's sort of rubbish call. No, it happened. I think it's my daughter, actually.
Oh,
um,
she's welcome
so,
to join.
yeah, right. Well, she'd be very sensible for this. She'd be great. Um, so I don't know. I can't offer, anything that hasn't already been obviously thought about, um, because and of course the big unknown is this question of how soon will we develop a viable vaccine, and
Mhm.
because that is a determinant factor. And but it's clear that the thing that we do have to do, what I'm more concerned about, the two things actually, that one is we need to put in place a whole structure for dealing with these situations. Um, and
Right.
that structure needs to be both locally, federally, so to speak, and globally. Because one of the things we haven't said, that's been said, a bit of a platitude, is that this is a truly unique event in the sense that it is the first truly global event that's ever happened. I mean, socioeconomically, that affects really potentially every person on the planet. Almost 7.5 billion of us, in some way or another, is affected by this. Never before has there been a situation like this. The major events have always been confined to Europe or China or whatever.
Right.
So it's unique in that sense, and so we need to think truly globally, but we also have to think globally. But we need to put a whole infrastructure in place in order to immediately deal with this type of problem, but also other problems. And one of the things, the other second point is that, and we're not paying enough attention to it, this is a highly scaled down version of what is actually already happening anyway, which is the faster than exponential expansion and leading to collapse. And
Right.
the thing that's worse about the socioeconomic situation is, unlike the pandemic, which despite the image is actually self-limiting. If we didn't have, it would stop after a while anyway. Actually, that's the nature of
Right.
epidemics and pandemics. But it is not the nature of the socioeconomic super exponential expansion, open-ended growth, and the naivete that this can go on forever. That, unless you intervene with a analog to a vaccine, we're going to have a catastrophe that is so much bigger than anything we could imagine from this pandemic.
Well, I love that you're bringing that up, because I know that's been a big point and focus of your work in your book Scale, which is how long can this sort of exponential growth go
Yes.
on for? Maybe you can just dig a bit deeper into what you are referring to. So when you talk about the socioeconomic impact, talk a little bit more for the audience around what you are referring to, and then what you think are some of the ways it can start to think about curtailing that growth, and obviously these things need to be intervened with as opposed to
Yes.
just allowed to go on forever. What are some of those suggestions?
Well, the origin of all this is, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, this superlinear behavior of scaling. That is, the bigger the city, the more you have per capita of socioeconomic activity, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And all of that derives from the positive feedback mechanisms that are inherent in our social networks. And one of the things that leads to, that super exponential behavior, is that as you grow faster and faster. The bigger you are, the faster you grow. And then
Right.
the bigger you are, then the faster you grow, even more so. And that's classic exponential growth. Actually, it's super exponential. It's even faster than exponential, but nevertheless,
Mm-hmm.
it's exponential growth. And that has built into it. This has built into it something that mathematicians call a finite time singularity. And the word singularity that people bandy around comes from that. And that is that in some finite time, could be 5, 10 years, 100 years in the future, the system will become so big that it can't sustain itself, and the system collapses in a finite time. And the way we have avoided that, the way one does avoid that, is the way we have, and that is we make a paradigm shift. We reinvent ourselves. We
Mm-hmm.
we go through a new major innovation. We discover coal, we invent computers, we invent IT, and these sort of reset the clock. And it could be, going back to your previous question, the pandemic is resetting the clock for us, because it is a discontinuity, and it may be big enough that it sort of resets the clock for something, for a new innovation. But the point is that one of the things that comes along with this idea that you have to innovate in order to so to speak, stay ahead of the curve, which is what we've done brilliantly, is
Mm-hmm.
that the real problem is that you have to do it faster and faster. It's not even so much that you have to innovate and make these paradigm
Right.
shifts, but you have to do it faster and faster, and viscerally we feel it. We feel that, that things are faster, and all the data points to that. And one of the ironies I have been surprised at, by the way, is that I thought it was because I'm an old fart, that after a couple of weeks of relaxation when this thing began and I was at home, I began to find that with Zoom and Skype and telephone calls and all the rest of the stuff going on, um, you know, podcasts and all the rest of it, that I was having no time. So even though I had more time, I sort of had less time
Hmm.
again. And I thought,
Right.
this is crazy. And I thought, it's because I can't. But I discovered all my young colleagues were complaining of the same thing. And I thought, shit, it goes along with this bloody theory that I talked about. I can't believe the
Right.
pandemic is doing the same thing. That it's actually speeding up life in some weird way, even
Right.
though no one's doing anything. We're not, and we kind of feeling. So I don't know if this is just sort of
No,
bullshit
I
talk
think
at the moment.
it's
But
such a great segue. There's a lot of questions, so I wanna sort of say this is a
sure,
great way to wrap up, which is just this notion that this continued drive for scale and growth, is unsustainable.
sure.
And actually, one of our previous guests, who I'd love to connect you with if you aren't connected, is Roger Martin, who really focuses
Right,
on
right,
a lot of this in business, and basically is saying it's unsustainable, right? And we've caused such
right.
polarity in society as a result of it, that it's time
Yes,
to
exactly.
rethink, how we use our attention and our capital. And so, on that note, maybe I'm going to ask you for your hope, I guess. If this is the reset button, what do you hope people uh, really take away? And maybe we'll make it a brief one, and we'll jump to questions, because there's some really great
Well, I
questions
have
from the
two
audience.
hopes. One is, of course, we do discover a vaccine and we get over this damn thing,
Of course.
obviously. But on a bigger picture, I'm hoping, but I think I don't have much confidence that it'll come to fruition, that people will understand what an exponential is at last, that they will understand the threat of an exponential, and that they can extrapolate from that, which is only over a few months that we've dealt with this,
Mhm.
to something that's happening over several decades, and that there isn't a hell of a lot of time left, and that we better come to terms with it, and we better start thinking again much more systemically, much more interconnectedly, in a much more integrated fashion, and to not to supplant what we were doing. We go on that, but we need to expand the horizons and think much bigger,
Absolutely.
and
Well,
deal
that
with
is
this problem. And
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are two great hopes, and I certainly, I that really resonates with me. All that you said there. So let's take it to questions. First question is from Tomer Strolite, and he says, "Even possible to stop the exponential increase in the scale and speed of change?"
is it possible? Is that the
Yeah,
question? I missed the beginning.
that is the question.
Well, I don't know. I go back and forth on this one. It becomes very speculative again, um, because it needs what we saw a little bit of here. What people are beginning to talk about is a sort of fundamental cultural change. We need to think differently, and there are signs of it. I mean, the paradigm is open-ended growth. It's been unbelievably successful.
Mhm.
The spirit of capitalism and entrepreneurship has been fantastic in producing the kind of society we have. It's got some very bad unintended consequences, which we haven't been good at dealing with, but nevertheless, it's been enormously successful. And the question is, can we have our cake and eat it too? Can we keep up this idea of
Mhm.
innovation and ideas, new lives, and yet not continue on an exponential curve, which is going to take us over the edge? And that does need a new cultural thinking. It needs companies to
Mhm.
rethink, which some are, what their role in society is. I mean, they were
Sure.
founded to be the intermediary between the artisan and the people. It's an efficient way of
Sure.
getting goods to people. Well, and the profit motive was ultimate and was it. But I think some companies are beginning slowly to realize that that's not just part of it, that they have social responsibility, which governments had before, and governments are
Right.
becoming less good at dealing with those. And so the two parts of society which I think should be taking much greater role are cities, because that's where the action is, and companies should be playing role, not controlling, but like companies should become more like cities, expanding horizons again, and whether they can make that cultural shift. So that's one example of the kind of cultural shifts we need.
I think that's really helpful, and I couldn't agree more with what you're saying.
But,
so thanks for the question, Tamer. So Richard Conway had a great question. He says, "I wonder what one wonders." What wonders are there in those file folders on that shelf behind Geoffrey's left shoulder? What is he working on, and what will he be writing about next?
you're going to chuckle at this. So to the person who asked the question, we set this up in a different place, but it turned out the internet connection was poor, and I had to come to where I could connect directly to the incoming line. So I'm on a wired system at the moment, and it's in a little cubby hole, which is sort of a little office where all our finances and things are. And those folders behind me are taxes, tax the last couple of years, I'm embarrassed to say, and I'm embarrassed because I'm behind on my taxes. I'm delinquent. So this may be the last podcast I ever do before they take me to Guantanamo or somewhere.
That's
what those are. No, but what am I working on? I'm sorry, that was frivolous. But well, I continue to work on all the things we've talked about actually, and I did work more recently because I got interested in the COVID. The things I worked out, which are not published, not written up, are two things I've sort of alluded to. One is to recognize, which people have not, that the size of the social group has a huge effect on the spread of the disease. That is, the city size, the bigger the city, I said it earlier, the faster the disease spreads and the many more cases you get. A city that's 100 times bigger than another one gets twice as many cases of COVID-19 in half the time, for example. So we need to understand that in terms of dealing with it. And the other thing I've been doing is the thing which I really enjoyed, is to think about the transmission of COVID, relating it to the transmission of ideas, and to try to understand a little more about the dynamics of innovation itself, which I'd worked on before, but not in this framework. It was sort of interesting that the framework, when thinking about the transmission of disease, I realized that this whole framework just fits beautifully into this idea, and that maybe would give some insights into innovation and idea creation. So that's one of the things I'm working. Meanwhile, I'm working all kinds of other things to do with sleep and brains and, I don't know, cancer, all kinds of other interesting things that are all, believe it or not, interrelated to this.
Super relevant, and very excited to see more from you. And for those who haven't read Geoffrey's article on in The Economist, we'll post a link to it as well, because it deals with some of these ideas, and very excited about the connectivity between innovation.
The article was not written by, I should say, the Economist article was not written by me. It was written about some of my work. I did not write it.
I apologize. Your name was
although I should say, I probably shouldn't say this, but I think there's an article that I have written with someone else that might come out in the Financial Times. They're very reluctant to have any scientists write, but we'll see.
Okay, great.
It'll be out somewhere about this.
Very excited to keep in the loop on your ideas here. Well, Geoffrey, I just want to say there's one more. Let me see. We'll have time for one more, which I think is a really good one, which says, is there anything we can do to lower the odds for positive versus negative benefits of scale?
Oh boy, that's hard. I think the only answer I can give is to first recognize that the positive and negative are actually interrelated. That is that, it all goes back a little bit to, I hate to say this, the second law of thermodynamics and the idea of entropy. That is, I'm sure that you've all heard of the second law, you've heard of entropy. But basically what it says, if you use energy to create order, you know, create a company, you create a cell, you make a car, you necessarily create disorder somewhere else. And that's it. I mean, that's the most fundamental law of the universe, that you create disorder, you create pollution, you create junk, and so on. Friction and so forth. So, so the idea is that if you do, this is like social entropy, namely, in making good things, in having a company that's very efficient in producing interesting goods, or a city that's working very well and producing lots of ideas and quality of life for people and so on. All these things, inevitably, you simply have to accept the fact that there's going to be a price to pay, and that is entropy, social entropy. You're going to have traffic jams inevitably, and you're going to, or these may not be specific things, but you're going to have analogs to traffic jams and poverty and some smog and so forth. There's all these things are going to happen, and the point is that you need to try simply to mitigate against those by seeing that they're all interconnected and actually connected to the bigger picture. So that's not a very good answer, because then you have to dig down, and there's no time for that. But it's that the first important thing is to get that conceptual framework of seeing it as a system of interconnectivity, and good, bad, and ugly come along together, and there is an inevitability to that. And to face that, just like in your ordinary life, you can't always be happy.
Right. Well, what a great way to end. That's such a great way of wrapping up this conversation. Obviously, I would love to spend hours continuing this conversation, as I think many of the people on this call would. But thank you so much for your insights, your amazing work, and we can't wait to see more from you, especially as it relates to innovation and pandemics and the interrelatedness there. Again, thank you so much for your time. And thank you to everybody for listening. I just want to give a quick shout out to our production team. They're live making this happen. Corey, Marr, and the Game Changer team, we really appreciate everything you've done to put this together. And we have great partners in CBC, CIX, York University, Toronto Life, Talk Boutique, and Artery, who are all interested in bringing brilliant minds like Geoffrey West to this community to help us navigate these interesting times. Have a great week, everyone, and hope to see you again. There is no session next week, just to let everybody know, because it's a public holiday. See you the week after. Looking forward to it. Have a great week.